Okay, guys, this is a bit of a couple different things going on here. We're after spending a couple weeks diving deep into the Gospels, we're zooming out a bit. This is the first week that we'll actually start looking at, well, aside from the correspondence with Agbar, we'll start looking at some texts that were not in the New Testament, but are Gospels or are about Jesus in some way. So we'll start looking at that. We'll get to the Gospel of John next week. And you'll see, once you crack open and start reading about the Gospel of Thomas, the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, you'll see why I think I thought it was good to follow up the Synoptic Gospels with Thomas. But here we're going to take a bit of a break from kind of the getting deep into a big text like the Synoptics, and instead, zoom out pretty far back and take a bigger look at kind of the outlines of Christian history in the first few centuries, and take our first of two looks at the creation of the New Testament canon. And canon, just so we're clear, is just the word we use for the collection of texts that make up any scriptural body, right? So the 27 books of the New Testament, that's the canon of the New Testament. And the question is, how do we get those 27 books and not others? And how did we get a canon in the first place? So one of the things that people are always interested in when they take a class like this, or they take Intro to New Testament, is how did we get the canon, right? How do we get these books? Why are these books part of the Bible and not others? And this class, I think, is going to focus a bit more in the coming weeks on those kind of books that didn't make it in, right? And so, like, what do we even mean when we say that a book didn't make it in? Was it like there's a bubble and there's the first two in and the first two out, and some of the ones we're going to look at starting with this week are the ones that were just on the bubble and didn't make it in, or like how does this even really work? And these are all really good questions about canonization and how we got the Bible that we have today. But I want to just point out that there are some things that I think preoccupation with canon might kind of betray about us and how we think about this material. And so, yeah, the first thing that I think that this kind of focus on canonization, which again is a totally legitimate, historical thing to be interested in, but I think it reveals, first of all, it reveals a preoccupation with text over practice or over church authority. That is very kind of Protestant and very kind of modern. Because with Protestantism developing in the 16th century and intensifying in really significant ways over the next several centuries up until our own time, you start to get this idea that especially if coming from a Christian perspective, that Christian faith is dependent on just the scriptures. The scriptures alone was kind of one of these rallying cries of the Protestant Reformation. But as we've kind of already seen with the Greek Bible, and as we'll continue to see through this lecture, when it comes to the New Testament specifically, the church and Christianity existed before the New Testament. And the New Testament was something that came about as a development of Christianity. And so potentially, if you're from a Roman Catholic background, or if you're from an Orthodox Eastern Church perspective, this may not be as this may be just obvious to you, but if you come from a Protestant background, sometimes I think it's surprising for Protestants to consider the idea that the church existed before the New Testament did, right? The New Testament was being written by the early church over the first 70 to 100 years of Christianity. And so, the New Testament as we have it is itself a product of the church. It didn't create the church. And that kind of then gets us into, for those of you who want to, for your own purposes, not with me, hopefully, but, argue about, how we should think of that early church and how, which kind of modern churches best represent that early church. But ultimately, there's a lot of this obsession with canon as being the basis, right? New Testament being the basis of Christianity. And whereas that's possible to kind of practice now, when you can pick up a New Testament in a hotel room, or you can just get to it online. You can find New Testament scriptures, and you can kind of create your own faith just based on that, supposedly, right? You're going to have your own prejudices and your own biases and assumptions that guide your reading of that text. But theoretically, you could just pick up a Bible and just create Christianity, your own version of Christianity from that. But that's not how it happened historically. And so I think some of the obsession with canon about, which books are in and out really kind of overplays, really how much power these texts had to create what we know of as Christianity. Christianity already existed, and Christianity then chose a canon that reflected itself rather than the other way around. Part of this, too, in a more big picture perspective, is just the way that a lot of our ideas about religions in general, like what a religion is and what it counts as, are shaped by, our own kind of cultural conception of religion. And in the West, especially in Europe and in America, that's, Christianity, and then Judaism is kind of this other thing that's like, from the perspective of some Christians, not in reality, but from the perspective of some Christians, it's like the knockoff version, the incomplete version of Christianity. And then you have Islam, which, for different people is either completely not on the radar at all, or it's, a heresy, or it's, just another kind of foreign religion. So Christianity really is, in the mindset of Western people historically, is kind of what I'm trying to summarize. Christianity is like the standard for what a religion is in general, right? And so basically, we want to compare things based on a standard that we understand. And so we look at, Judaism and Islam, they're religions too, and they both have like these holy books, right? And so the same must be true of anything else that's a religion. Hinduism has the Vedas. Okay, well that works. Buddhism has, they have a lot of different texts. But something like, Shinto in Japan, that is not textually based, in any significant way, can that be a religion? Is that really a religion? And, world religion textbooks will say yes, but it's hard to fit other different kinds of beliefs into this model, right? And so, canonization, I think, becomes significant when people are thinking on this model of comparing other religions to Christianity and trying to do this comparative religion thing where you have, you have the founder of the religion and you have the holy text of religion. And by definition, if you're a religion, you have to have all these things. So coming from that perspective, how will you get the books of the holy text of Christianity becomes very, very much more important. And this, of course, is derived from a idea about religions that comes from modeling them on Christianity, but maybe that's not even the best way to think about religion. Maybe that's already assuming something about what religion is that is kind of, culture specific to Europe and to the United States about, Christianity being the model and then therefore needing a holy text. And this last one is kind of the most, it's kind of the most abstract one, and the one that I'm not going to push too hard. But I do think there is a sense in which, the thing about, thinking about Christianity is that once you have a canon that is set, then you have some kind of like, timeless measuring stick. I mean, okay, so canon derived from the Greek word kanon, which literally means a measuring stick. So you have this kind of timeless measure by which you can judge, all of Christianity, past and present. And so, Christianities that existed and were vibrant before the New Testament was canonized and, conflict with what we now know as the New Testament, or then become heresies, right? And versions of Christianity since then, if they don't match up to the New Testament, they are then, this is heretical. And I do think there is a bit of a preoccupation on some people's part of really trying to figure out, okay, let's get the canon nailed down. If we're talking about history, let's figure out when it was established. Let's figure out, when it was set that everybody knew what the canon was. So then, you can have make this kind of judgment about, what types of Christianity are acceptable and not, because if there's, as long as there's confusion about the canon, as long as it's unclear, which books are in and out, then, I think for some people that gives too much room to potential different expressions of Christianity that might conflict with each other, or some people might see as it's theologically wrong. And so a lot of people kind of want to push that canon, as far into the past as possible, make it happen as early in history as possible, so that, things can get nailed down and laid out, and you don't have to worry about some of these, more intricate theological conflicts if you just have the canon that's there, and then you can use that as a measuring stick. So, basically in the history of the canon, you have two major elements. You have the actual creation of the text that will become part of the New Testament, and then you have the actual kind of separate act of taking those texts and putting them together in collections, and then naming this a canon, or naming this the New Testament, right? And historically, if you know anything about this subject, and there's lots of people who don't know a lot about this subject, who maybe think they know more than they do. Often they want to talk about the Emperor Constantine, who was the first emperor to, convert to Christianity, and they want to talk about church councils, or maybe if they're a little bit more well-informed, they'll talk about, the Council of Nicaea, which Constantine presided over, and they'll say well, this is the time that the canon was formed, and this is what people want to talk about. But they overlook, by doing this, and even if they have more nuanced ideas about how the canon was formed, the Christianity of the 2nd and 3rd centuries often gets overlooked. And this early Christianity, right? This is the stuff that I like. My dissertation is in this time period. I can teach New Testament stuff, but this is something that I'm very familiar with. So I'm gonna, have a vested interest in kind of making this more significant. But it really is, because, Constantine didn't happen in a vacuum. Those church councils didn't happen in a vacuum. The idea of a canon didn't just pop out of nowhere, and it wasn't just kind of a natural historical progression. All of those things that people tend to associate with the creation of the New Testament canon were kind of, and they weren't always natural or automatic, but they were outgrowths of Christianity as it developed over its first couple hundred years. And so, the process of canonization starts very early, even though you don't, have settled lists. What you do have are people who are collecting different groups of texts and putting them together. I've already kind of made mention, I think, of the fact that, very early on, we have collections of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We haven't covered John in detail yet, but we have collections of all 4 Gospels circulating very early, right? We have collections of Paul's text circulating very early. And none of these constitute a canon that looks like the New Testament canon, but you already have, people putting things together at a very, very early stage, right? So this idea of how did the canon form, why do we have these books and not others, isn't just as simple as, some council getting together in secret somewhere and just drawing up a list and then making a decree, or an emperor making a decree that this is the New Testament. It really didn't happen that way. So again, kind of zooming out in a big way, I think early Christianity, right, this period from, the New Testament era all the way through to the 4th century, which gives us Constantine. It gives us the first major church council at Nicaea. Three big things, and obviously there's a lot more I could talk about, but I'm just going to summarize it this way. Three big results of early Christianity, three significant ones. So the first one is, why do we need scripture at all? Why does, again, looking back to the past through our own lens, it seems natural that Christians should have their own scripture. But that makes sense because Christianity, as we've talked about, is so deeply tied to Judaism. But their tie to Judaism is to the Jewish scriptures, the Greek Bible, right? So why would the Christians necessarily need their own texts, especially if there's no other religious groups out there that really use texts the same way that Christians eventually would, right? So why would this happen? The next question would be, again, why new, right? So if you already have the Greek Bible, as we've talked about, people were like Justin Martyr, they were deriving information about Jesus from the Greek Bible. So why did they need anything else on top of that? And then the question is, who gets to decide what Scripture is? What is the authority that makes this possible? And the issue of Gnosticism, which we'll kind of address in a very surface way in this lecture, but we'll continue to talk about over the coming weeks, is, Gnosticism is another thing that is really significant in determining how Christians started to think about their Scripture and why a canon might be necessary. Just a quick reminder here of kind of the world that we're looking at. We've already talked about the Jewish diaspora and how that was spread throughout the world. And so, you have Christians following that Jewish diaspora. You have Christians, centered around Jerusalem and Judea. We have Christians in Antioch and Damascus and other places in Syria, in Alexandria. We know that, from the Gospels, if you remember, a guy from Cyrene was cited as the one who had to help Jesus carry his cross. So obviously there were Christians by the time the Gospels were written who are from this part of North Africa, right? All through Asia, you have letters, Paul's letter to the Galatians, you have other cities, Ephesus, Colossae are here on side of Asia, Thessalonica is up here, Athens, Acts says that, Paul went to Athens and eventually got to Rome. So you have Christians spread out all over this whole area. So again, we've talked about how Christians were very closely related to Jewish communities. Sometimes these are people who are from Jewish communities, people we would call Jews. Sometimes they are people who are not originally from Jewish communities, right? They have a different nationality or allegiance. We call these people Gentiles, right? But either group could be Christian, right? And so part of the issue with Christians is that they start doing things on their own, right? They start from the very beginning. They have this the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, communion, right, where they have bread and they have wine and they practice eating this in memory of Jesus. They have baptism, which was a kind of initiatory rite that would have been common. There were versions of kind of ritual immersion that existed in Judaism, other kind of rites that existed in pagan Greco-Roman practice, and so this wouldn't be something that was totally new to people in the Mediterranean world, but they had their own, right? They at least had their own that kind of marked it off as this is the Christian baptism. So they're already gathering and doing things on their own. And so they start to kind of be isolated, sometimes, just by natural social forces, the way that human relationships work. Maybe the Christians grow to such a size that they can't be integrated totally into the Jewish community. Maybe there are people within the community who really want to push them away from being associated with Judaism, especially if they are, Gentile, right? If they don't as we talked about some of these issues of, Jewish assimilation, the language and the Jewish culture and the Jewish practices. If people were interested in worshiping the Jewish God through Jesus, but they didn't want to deal with all those practices, then they might want to push groups of Christians farther away from the Jewish community. And so you start getting a bit of isolation, right? And so then, aside from their separation from the Jewish communities of the diaspora, there's also their separation, now their own kinds of separation from the world around them, right? Their own potential issues with assimilation, right? And so they only believe in the one God, and that can't be identified with any other God within polytheism. The other thing, though, is that they believe that all the other gods of the ancient world were evil spirits, and this is a thing that seems to be distinctively Christian, right? Now, the Jews don't seem to be, the Jews seem to have potentially during the diaspora a low view, kind of a bad view of other gods. Obviously they weren't as accepting in general as monotheists. They thought their God was the only one who should be worshipped. And so, naturally there would be some denigration of, other people and their worship. But at the same time, they couldn't really, being kind of this very visible minority, they couldn't be super critical of, the world around them. They had to be, they might say things behind closed doors, but they're not going to be openly critical of the gods of like the cities that they're living in. And I don't think the Christians were super critical either, but the stuff that they say behind closed doors, in Christian writings, they thought that all the other gods of the ancient world, they weren't just other gods. They thought they were not gods, so they were both kind of demoting them in terms of their power, and they're saying they're evil spirits, led by Satan. And so, this is not just kind of like a mental construction, right? So obviously they believe this in their heads, but if you think about the way that an ancient city was devised, there's temples everywhere, there are shrines in people's houses, there are statues on street corners of ancient gods that Christians would have believed were, associated with these other gods, these things that they thought were demons, right? So they're living in a world, they're being surrounded by a world where there are demons everywhere, and they're very, they're very stressed out about this. And so, they didn't get out a lot. And it was tough for them to really kind of find their footing if, on one hand, they, that obviously they were going about their daily life and doing their jobs and stuff like that. But when they were, as a community, they found themselves on one hand like really isolated and really struggling to interact with the world around them of your standard Greco-Roman city in the Mediterranean because of what they believed about the gods that they were surrounded with, and then on the other hand you had people pushing them to separate socially from the Jewish community. So they started to get into kind of a bind and kind of isolated. So one thing the early Christians really leaned into, and if we had started with, if we started this class with the Apostle Paul, right? If this were a straight up New Testament class, it would be a bit easier to see some of this. We saw some of this 2 weeks ago when we talked about Luke. We talked about some of the women that were mentioned in ancient Christianity. We talked about Acts, about letters that are being passed and forth, or passed back and forth, apostles that were traveling around. The Christian communities, again, even if we go even farther back towards the beginning of the semester, talking about, the fact that all these texts are in Greek, and who are the kinds of people that would generally know Greek? Well, they're people who are traveling, or people who are dealing with people who are traveling. So merchants, traders, people whose jobs are itinerant, right? Jobs that take them around the Mediterranean. This is what Paul himself was doing, right? He was traveling to find different jobs. And so, these very kind of isolated communities were preserved by personal connections of people who would travel around. It wasn't just Paul, he was traveling for the kind of like missionary travel that we would think of in contemporary Christianity, right, where you raise a bunch of money and then you go to a foreign country and then you work there spreading the gospel, or whatever you're doing in that place. Paul's missionary journeys were sometimes funded by people, but other times, when he was going around from place to place, it was because he was following jobs. And so Paul is not unique in that regard. Some of the authority that he seems to have and the way that he spent so much time purposely building up his particular network of churches, like that does make him that does separate him out. That is reflective of his self-identification as an apostle. But it doesn't mean that he was the only one traveling that way. Other people were traveling all over as well. We have a lot of evidence, especially from the Pauline letters, but from other places, of people who are mentioned as, oh, they were traveling here, or this person was with me in this city. Now they're there in that city. Like we know that people were moving around a lot between these communities. And again, it's kind of unclear. Did Christians purposefully kind of invest in these types of careers? Did they take these up on purpose? Or did it so happen that, at the beginning, Christianity kind of rose up naturally among people who were already able to do this? It's a significant question, but you have apostles, you have evangelists, teachers, prophets. You have all kinds of people who are traveling around, again, for work, or maybe, their own home churches are sponsoring their movement, but they're going around giving instruction, right? They're teaching about theology, they're teaching about conduct, they're passing on oral tradition about things Jesus said or things that they think Jesus said. And so, during the early period of Christianity, if you think about a Pauline church, right, where the Apostle Paul founds this church and then he moves on and then he writes letters, he teaches them while he's there. He writes letters to them with more instruction. He sends people there to instruct them. In communities where there is all this movement already, why was Scripture really necessary? Like, why was it necessary to preserve these letters that Paul wrote, or preserve this document, this gospel that shows up that became known as, the Gospel of Mark, or what became known as Gospel of Matthew? Like, why is it necessary to preserve all this stuff and have stuff in writing when you already have this whole network of people who are moving around and who are, credentialed in the terms of being accepted by Christian communities as, authentic teachers and preachers? Like, why do you need something written down if you have all this? So I would say basically that writing things down starts to reduce the strain of these separated communities, right? Part of the thing about having someone who is passing through is that they can give you some teaching, they can give you a word of wisdom, maybe they have a charismatic experience where they prophesy or speak in tongues. But then, someone could come in the next week and teach something totally different, right? Or they could just, you could just have people who are giving you different, one person comes in and prophesies one thing for your community, and the next week someone comes in and prophesies something different, right? And so as these communities grow and they're really looking for stability, the texts give them that stability. Right, so this is the sayings of Jesus start to be collected. The sermons or the prophecies are written down. Some things like, again, not a text we're going to look at, but if you're familiar with the New Testament, something like the book of Hebrews really looks like a sermon, right? It looks like someone preached a sermon, and it may have in fact been something that in one community, someone comes through and preaches a sermon and someone copied down what they said. And so then this began to be transmitted, as if it were a letter. People very early on thought it was a letter of Paul, right? But this could be notes of sermons or prophecies that people had said that then the community can write down, and it won't be just the people who can remember it, but it will be there in the community in a physical form. Right, and so like the letters of Paul, once Paul dies, if you keep his letters around, you can continue to go back to those letters as source of instruction. And of course, the thought that should be, in your head here is like, well, didn't they already have a text, right? They already had a Bible. As I've been kind of I've kind of been insisting from the beginning here. So as I've been hammering home again, why couldn't this kind of source of stability actually become something that they used the Greek Bible for? Why was it necessary to add this additional Christian scripture if they already had that, right? And so just to remind us here that there was no concept of a New Testament for basically 100 years after the death of Jesus, right? Nobody had any reason to add anything to the Greek Bible in terms of being scripture, right? Not that they, obviously texts were preserved, obviously the Gospels were preserved, but they weren't treated the same way. First of all, not everyone had all of them, right? You might have the Gospel of Mark in some places, you might have the Gospel of Matthew in others, you might have some of Paul's letters in one place and some in another. Not everyone had all of it. And so you have, a century almost of Christianity where the one thing, again, this goes back to my argument about Luke, about why he would want to tie his gospel so closely to the Septuagint, is that that's what all the Christians had, right? So what is it that kind of made them say, okay, we've been preserving these texts, we've been holding on to them, but we need to start considering them as scripture in a way that we haven't before. All right, so what was the thing that kind of changed that for them? The answer is Marcion, the first heretic that we've encountered so far, and really kind of like he's often referred to as the arch heretic because he is the big one. He is the first guy who, in terms of his teaching and writing, there's other people that are referenced as false teachers. In the New Testament text, there's a guy named Simon Magus in the book of Acts who shows up, who battles with Peter. But Marcion is like the first heretic and probably one of the most successful heretics, actually. He didn't look like any of these things, I think, but at the same time, it's hard to know what he looks like because here you have actually a picture of him debating scripture with one of the apostles or one of the saints, and his face has been scratched out because he is a heretic, at least according to the church that eventually survived and became the church we know as Christianity today. All right, so who was Marcion? What was his deal? Unfortunately, we don't know a lot. We don't have much of his original writings except for what was preserved by kind of Orthodox Christians, as they would put quotations into their documents and then refute them. So we have quotations and we have information about what he wrote. But a lot of what he wrote and what his followers wrote was lost, whether simply kind of it was just passively kind of neglected, or it was actively destroyed. We know that the active destruction of manuscripts is something that did occur, within Christianity. But some of the basic outlines. He comes from Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. So he came from a city called Sinope on the Black Sea. He went from there to Rome about 135 CE. So this is around the time of Justin. Justin, I don't think in Dialogue with Trypho, so not in the text that we read that excerpt from, but in his other works, Justin talks about Marcion, and is in fact one of our earliest sources about Marcion. But so he's coming from the Black Sea area, and he seems to be already a pretty wealthy and influential guy because he's going to Rome, which at this time, is obviously kind of the center of the empire, but also seems to have, by this point, gained a critical mass of population of Christians, and the Bishop of Rome being one of the most prominent bishops, not the only one, but one of the more prominent bishops in the Mediterranean, was at this point, and again, we don't have to get into the debates about Catholicism and whether the papacy existed at this point. Let's just say he was an influential bishop at this point. And And so he comes to Rome and he tries to propagate his particular theology in Rome. And we know he was a rich guy because he offered to pay them a lot of money to kind of make him a bishop in Rome, or at least a member of the church. But here's the deal. The thing that he was trying to push was bitheism, right? And, this seems very weird to us because we're very used to thinking in the dichotomy of, one God or many, and it's an either or. There's only one, either it's monotheism or it's polytheism. But I hope as you remember, and hopefully you kind of, this was reminded, or this was brought to mind when you were studying for the exam, that, polytheism, first of all, doesn't mean just many gods necessarily. It means kind of a freedom to choose gods. And at the same time, monotheism was a weird idea, right? And so bitheism, saying, well, there's two gods, I don't see, on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be any reason why this would be less kind of surprising as a concept to someone of this time period. Now, obviously, these Orthodox Christians disagreed very strongly, and Jews would disagree very strongly. And sure, many polytheists probably say, well, there can't be only two gods. But still, the idea of two gods, isn't any weirder in context than the idea of one God, right? That's all. But what he believed was that there was an evil God who was the God of the Jews. That was the God of the Jewish scriptures, and then there was this new, stranger, alien God who was the father of Jesus Christ. And so when Jesus talks about his father, he's not talking about the God of the Jews or the God of the Hebrew Bible. He's talking about another God, a new God, and this has some consequences, right? Kind of the consequence was that he rejected Jewish scripture, right? So Greek Bible, Hebrew Bible, he rejected it as valid for Christians. He thought it accurately predicted the Messiah, but he thought the Messiah, Christ, actually revealed a completely different God than the one that the Jews had. And so in Marcion's community and in his churches, because we know he founded multiple churches, like the author of Luke, he had this idea of Christianity as being kind of a global phenomenon, a Catholic phenomenon, which is why he, potentially why he went to Rome in the first place, right? It was because he wanted not just to have his own church in his own city, but he wanted to build churches all over the Mediterranean that followed his teachings. So he wanted to reject scripture as valid for Christians, and he also had issues with any Christian writings that utilize the Bible in any way, right? So he would have had an issue with Matthew's fulfillment passages. He would have had an issue with Paul when Paul quoted scripture. He would have had an issue with parts of Luke, right? And so part of what he did here, he couldn't reject all those things outright because then he'd have nothing. So what he did was he got rid of the Greek Bible, and he put together a collection of some of the letters of Paul, but ones that he expunged the references to the Bible from those letters, and one gospel, which was a version of Luke that also kind of took out these mentions of the Greek Bible. And this became his new set of scriptures for himself and for his churches. Now that they couldn't use the Greek Bible, they needed something else, and to kind of have some stability and unity between their different churches, they would use these texts, right? These would become the new central texts of their faith. So while Marcion directly and kind of drastically threatened the scriptures of early Christianity, which again, still primarily the Greek Bible, what this meant was, because he did reject that, he invented the idea of a New Testament, right? Marcion, the heretic, is the guy who gave us the idea of having a New Testament in the first place. And sure, it's possible that you see this kind of scripturalization right before Marcion. It's possible that there are communities that were reverencing, say, the Gospel of Mark or the letters of Paul, with the same way they would think of the Greek Bible. We don't have any evidence for that. The first evidence we have of Christians having any idea of a New Testament, of a specifically Christian collection of scripture that would go alongside the Bible, that we don't know about that until after Marcion, and Marcion kind of gives us the explanation for why that would happen. So yeah, Marcion gave us the idea of a bounded, exclusive connection or collection, right? So there's a limit to it. You can't add, you can't subtract. You're stuck with this group of texts that were authoritative on the same level as the Greek Bible. And in reality, the New Testament we have today is still modeled after Marcion's, roughly, right? He had the letters of Paul, and he had one gospel. We have more letters of Paul and more Gospels, but that's still the bulk of the New Testament. I mean, Paul wrote, or there are 13 letters attributed to Paul, and plus the 4 Gospels. Then you add, if you add Acts, that's the majority of the New Testament. And the idea of placing a collection of Christian scriptures alongside of Jewish scripture, right? So, doing what Marcion did in terms of having New Testament, but not doing the other thing he did, which is throwing out the Greek Bible. This is how you get to the idea of having new and old in the first place, right? It wasn't about just chronology. These came before and these came after. It was the idea that, Christians still believed that, the Greek Bible was totally authoritative. What they now had was a collection of scripture that was exclusively Christian, that was specifically Christian, right? And so that was covering, only the topic of the new revelation that was in Jesus, right? So this gives us the new revelation or the new covenant, the New Testament versus the Old. So yeah, I wanted to try and address 3 things, right? So I wanted to try to address, why would Christians need their own scripture at all, right? And so I suggested that this was because the communities were, isolated in some ways, and they did have interconnections, but those interconnections weren't necessarily stable. So keeping things written down would be a source of stability for these communities. And then, why would they need a New Testament in addition to an old one? Well, because Marcion invented this idea of a New Testament, and Christians quickly realized that if they were going to combat Marcionism, they needed to have their own collection. And also, they just realized it was a good idea. Like, he kind of introduced the concept, and people latched onto that, even if not all of them latched onto the idea of getting rid of the Greek Bible. And the final question is how criteria developed. How did criteria develop for determining which scriptures would go into the canon? Like, what would qualify, right? And so the kind of answer there, and a very simplified answer, is Gnosticism. And what is Gnosticism? That's Gnosticism. Pretty simple, right? Easy. Self-explanatory? Yeah. Make sure you take all that down. Kidding. I'm just kidding. You don't take all this down. Seriously, yeah. No, I mean, that was a diagram of a particular Gnostic myth, and if it looked crazy and complicated, it's because it is crazy and complicated. And we'll actually get into that myth further down in the semester, and I won't try to make sure you understand all of it, but hopefully I can make some of it make sense to you, the some that I know. But for the purposes of what we're doing right now, Gnosticism, broadly, generally speaking, was, certain people who are part of Christian groups who believed that there were more steps in the process of being a Christian, right? So it wasn't just baptism, it wasn't just joining a community, it was then also learning special secrets. The word Gnosticism comes from gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge. our word agnostic, if you say, I don't know if God exists, or you can just say you're agnostic about, things in general. I don't, that it's agnostic. It's, I don't know. So it's about knowledge, right? That diagram that I showed you is a particular myth that it seems like certain Christians, certain Gnostic Christians, were expected to know and understand, and that was part of their initiation into like the deeper levels of Christianity. And the way that they justify this claim is that they said that they had special secrets that were passed down from Jesus or Paul to subsequent disciples, right? So they weren't written down. They were passed down kind of orally, or they're passed down in secret at least, from Jesus or from Paul to other disciples, and kind of going in this special tradition. So, for the Gnostics, the true Christianity was, it included everything that we know about ancient Christianity. It included baptism. It included the Lord's Supper. It included, the study of the Greek Bible. It included, again, everything we would associate with early Christianity, church meetings, stuff like that. But it also took on this other dimension that separated the Gnostics from, the regular Christians, and made it more private and made it more individual, because there were suddenly now then initiates who were more Christian than there were others, than the people who were not initiated. And as you can imagine, this created some really deep social problems within Christianity. And so this idea brings us to how tradition became really significant in Christian communities. So the idea of this gnosis, this knowledge being passed down, and kind of this disciple-to-disciple relationship was countered with the idea of apostolic succession. And apostolic succession is definitely something that you should mark down as something that will show up on your final gnosis as well. And this is why apostolicity became so important for canonicity in the first place, right? So the canon is traditionally explained by, these were books that were written by apostles, right? And the apostles, the definition does not necessarily just include the 12 disciples that Jesus has. This is kind of a wider category. This includes Paul, for instance. This would include Mark and Luke, as well as, John the disciple, the supposed author of the Gospel of John, the disciple Matthew. But the idea was that if you were going to have your Christian scripture, if you're going to have this New Testament, it should be the writings of the very earliest followers of Jesus, right? It should be that first generation of people who are personally approved by Jesus to send his message out, right? The very earliest Christians, right? And so this is kind of a move to defeat this idea of things being passed down, right? Because if you say, well, this text says this, and this is from one of the earliest Christians, if what you're saying, what you Gnostics are saying is true, if what you're saying contradicts what the original apostles were saying, then it can't be right, right? Something must have gotten lost along the way, or you're just making crap up, right? So this is why apostolic succession really becomes really significant, and it becomes, even more significant and more developed as time goes on. You have, certain cities tracing their churches back, to particular apostles. But that kind of move wasn't something the churches were originally, super concerned about. That didn't matter as much to them until Gnosticism came along and said, well, certain people are passing down this certain tradition. And so the Christians said, the Orthodox Christians said, no, we're going back to the original people. We're going back to the apostles. What they say trumps what you have to say. So then you have church leaders, specific people, right, who are then claiming apostolicity. They're claiming that they are the ones who are like the true inheritors of the apostolic message, right? Sometimes this is because they have texts, right? That, I have Paul's text, I have Peter's text. But sometimes they're doing kind of the same thing that the Gnostics were, saying like, well, this was the true teaching that's been passed down from the beginning. It just wasn't passed down in secret the way you Gnostics do it. We've passed it down in public. This has always been the tradition that's always been passed down. And probably in at least a few cases that really wasn't the case. There certainly were Orthodox people who were claiming that they had this tradition that they didn't, right? But, each city then is going to have someone, usually a bishop, who's kind of the center and the locus of this type of authority, right? This is the person who is entrusted with the true message of the apostles. And once you have, and there are plenty of other things other than like apostolic succession that went into the creation of the bishop as kind of the central authority in any given Christian city. But once you have like one person in each place who's kind of like the person in charge of, enforcing doctrine or, leading the community, then you actually have this situation where a church council is possible. The church councils were councils of bishops. They were ecumenical councils, and ecumenical is, much the same as the word Catholic. It means it's bringing people from all over. And what happened was bishops from churches all over got together beginning in the 4th century and started hashing stuff out, right? But in order for that idea of people getting together to hash stuff out to exist, you had to have the bishops in the first place, and you had to have this idea that they were authoritative in their own communities in terms of doctrine. And the interesting thing is that, bishops developed very quickly in the 2nd century of Christianity. The one bishop that was sometimes called the monarchical bishop because there's one of them in every Christian city. But, no one thought to hold a church council until, the time of Constantine. So even when Christians had the possibility of getting everyone together and getting them in a room, I don't know if they could actually fit in a room or not, but like getting them together and saying, okay, let's hash this out, let's work out our doctrine and stuff, let's work out our canon. Nobody did that until there was a Roman emperor who was also a Christian who said, guys, you need to stop disagreeing. Come get together here at Nicaea and figure things out. So it is actually something from outside of the kind of traditional structures of Christianity that actually got people to start standardizing Christian faith in the way that we're familiar with it today. Okay, that was a lot. Apologies if it felt like I was racing through it. There was kind of a lot I wanted to cover. I didn't realize, I guess, until now exactly how much I wanted to cover. Obviously, this is not the whole story of canonization. This is kind of the setup. We'll have another lecture towards the end of the semester that covers how things were kind of finalized and or not finalized, what actually happened at Nicaea, what didn't happen at the Council of Nicaea. So there will be more to this. This is kind of the part one, but I did want to address, I did want to zoom out a bit and see kind of how are these texts starting to fit together, especially now that this week we're starting to look at Christian texts that were written by Christians, that were used by Christians, that aren't in the New Testament, and that were rejected, kind of finally, eventually, for inclusion in the New Testament.